Everything taught about Egypt begins with the Pharaohs. That is a choice, and it was made long before the evidence was fully examined. 6,000 years before Narmer united the Nile Valley, people were aligning stone megaliths to the summer solstice in what is now the Saharan desert. Their cattle were domesticated before Egypt had cattle. Their calendars predate the dynastic calendar by millennia. None of this is disputed. The papers are published. The sites are excavated. The dates are confirmed by multiple independent methods. What you will not find in the standard account is any serious attempt to explain the connection. That absence is what this record is about. 10,000 years ago, the Sahara was grassland, seasonal lakes, migratory herds, a landscape that sustained large, semi-permanent human communities across terrain now uninhabitable for miles in every direction. Satellite imaging conducted between 1982 and 2003 mapped a network of ancient riverbeds, paleo channels, running beneath the sand from Sudan to the Mediterranean coast. The water was real. The people were real. Archaeologist Fred Wendorf spent 30 years at Nabta Playa, a dried lake basin in the southwestern Egyptian desert. What he published in 1998 should have changed the timeline. At Nabta Playa, his team uncovered organized village structures dating to 9,000 BCE. Not campsites. Structures, storage pits, and hearths arranged in deliberate rows. By 7,000 BCE, the inhabitants were herding domesticated cattle, 2,000 years before the Nile Valley shows evidence of the same. 2,000 years. That gap is enormous, and it sits right there in the stratigraphy, and the field walked past it. When the rain stopped and the grasslands died, those people went somewhere. Where they went and what they brought with them is the question that opens everything else. In 1991, Wendorf's team found something at the center of the Nabta Playa settlement that should have reorganized the field. Beneath layers of sediment, a megalithic stone circle, 6 slabs, roughly a meter high, arranged in 2 lines of sight, aligned precisely to the summer solstice sunrise of approximately 4,500 BCE. Read that date again. The Stonehenge trilithons were raised around 2,500 BCE. Nabta predates them by 2,000 years, sits deeper in Africa, and was surrounded by evidence of a cattle cult whose iconography surfaces, centuries later, in the earliest Egyptian religious art. The cattle skulls buried at Nabta were not refuse. They were placed upright with intentional orientation, beneath stone tumuli Wendorf's team classified as ceremonial. Similar arrangements, cattle skulls, deliberate placement, astronomical alignment, appear in the pre-dynastic Nile Valley by 4000 BCE. The motif travels north as the Sahara dries. That migration is documented in the stratigraphy, but no one, not one institutional effort, has traced what those people carried with them. Which ideas, which practices, which technical knowledge walked out of the dying grasslands and arrived at the Nile? Nobody asked. Here is what the Nile Valley contains by 3,500 BCE. Cemeteries, large ones, and they do not look like the beginning of anything. The Naqada II culture buried its dead with imported lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar resin from Lebanon, obsidian blades with a working edge finer than modern surgical steel, obsidian traced to a single volcanic source in Ethiopia, trade networks spanning 3,000 kilometers, organized enough to move luxury goods across deserts and mountain ranges. All of this is classified as pre-state, pre-literate, pre-civilization. The terminology is doing a lot of work. Tomb Uji at Abydos, excavated by the German Archaeological Institute in 1988, contained 150 inscribed labels dated to approximately 3,200 BCE. These are not proto-writing. They are administrative records, quantities, place names, ownership marks. The man buried there was not a pharaoh by later definition, but his tomb held storage jars from the southern Levant, ivory from Central Africa, a scepter of the same form dynastic kings carried for the next 3,000 years, and the organizational infrastructure of a state. The bureaucracy predates the king. That sequence matters, and no account that calls this period prehistory has ever reckoned with it. Narmer's palette, carved around 3100 BCE, now in the Cairo Museum, treated as a founding document, the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, the birth of the pharaonic state. Look at what the palette actually depicts. A king performing rituals with fully developed iconographic conventions, the double crown, the smiting posture, the serek. None of these appear anywhere in the archaeological record as works in progress. They arrive complete, already codified, already understood by every craftsman who carved them. Egyptologist Toby Wilkinson noted in 1999 that the Narmer palette represents a crystallization of pre-existing traditions, not an invention. That word, crystallization, names the gap without crossing it. The writing system presents the same problem. Egyptian hieroglyphs appear at Abydos around 3200 BCE with a phonetic complexity that linguists estimate takes centuries to develop. Those centuries are not in the record. The development happened somewhere in some form, and that somewhere remains unaccounted for. I have read every major treatment of early Egyptian writing published in the last 30 years. Not one attempts to reconstruct where those missing centuries went. In 1994, Boston University geologist Robert Schuch published a peer-reviewed analysis of the weathering on the Sphinx enclosure walls at Giza. The erosion is vertical and rounded, the signature of heavy, sustained rainfall, not wind-blown sand. The last period of rainfall sufficient to produce that profile in the Giza region ended between 7000 and 5000 BCE. Schuch did not claim the Sphinx was built in 7000 BCE. He published the geological evidence and asked when the stone was carved. The response from Egyptology was institutional, not scientific. The dating contradicts the dynastic timeline. Therefore, the geological interpretation must be wrong. The papers were published. The weathering is still there. The rebuttal never engaged the stratigraphy. We covered this pattern before in our earlier record on Sumer, and Egypt presents the identical structure. A civilization arrives with its infrastructure already assembled. The preceding centuries are labeled formative. The actual formation is absent. This is not a mystery. It is a question that discipline has chosen, repeatedly and in writing, not to pursue. The files are open. The choice is documented. And that distinction between what we do not know and what we have decided not to ask is the only thing separating the published record from the story we keep telling. The pre-dynastic record does not show a gap in human history. It shows a gap in the story institutions chose to tell. One that begins at the Pharaohs because everything before them complicates the narrative of how civilization starts. The Saharan pastoralists, the Nabta astronomers, the Abydos administrators, the anomalous weathering on a monument we still cannot fully date. These are not fringe claims. They are published findings, sitting in the same journals as the standard account, waiting for a framework willing to hold them. The honest position, based on the evidence as it stands, is that Egypt did not begin with the Pharaohs. It arrived at the Pharaohs from somewhere older, across a transition we have not yet mapped. That is what the record supports. Every paper and excavation report referenced in this video is publicly available. If this kind of work belongs on your screen, the channel is there when you need it.